Back on the record after our morning recess. The defendant, Mr. Rivera, is present along with all the attorneys of record. The defense may call their next witness.
The defense calls Kimberly Fenn.
Good morning. Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm the testimony about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, you can go ahead and be seated if you would, please. Go ahead.
Please state your full name.
Kimberly Michelle Fenn.
And if you could speak up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Kimberly Michelle Fenn.
Could you spell your last name for the record?
Yes, Fenn.
Where do you live, ma'am?
I live in Lansing, Michigan.
Where are you employed?
I'm employed at Michigan State University.
What do you do at Michigan State University?
I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology.
What training and experience do you have to be an associate professor at the Department of Psychology?
I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Delaware, where I majored in both psychology and English. I graduated magna cum laude and was a member of the Phi Beta Kappa Honors Society. I then went on to do a master's degree at the University of Chicago in social sciences. I graduated with that in the year 2000. I then went on to get a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, also at the University of Chicago, culminating in 2006.
So your education finished in 2006 with a master's degree, is that right?
With a PhD, I'm sorry.
With a PhD. All
Apologize.
right, that's a big distinction. When did you start working for Michigan State University?
I began as an assistant professor in the year 2008. Between 2006 and 2008, I was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Chicago.
In Michigan State University, did you start as an associate professor, or did you start with a different position?
Yes, I started as an assistant professor, so you're an assistant professor for approximately 6 years. An associate level simply means that you have tenure.
All right, and explain, I was under the misunderstanding that you are hired to teach when you're hired on to a university such as Michigan State University. Is that true?
That is not correct. So that is true for liberal arts schools. So smaller liberal arts colleges are teaching focused. At a school like Michigan State, we're focused on research, so it's considered a Research 1 university, meaning that we are more interested in research. So we're hired for our research, and research is supposed to be approximately 75% of our job duties. The remaining 25% is for teaching. So currently I teach 2 courses per year.
All right. So the courses that you have taught have probably varied somewhat, is that right?
A little bit. There are approximately 4 different courses I've taught.
All right, let's go over those different courses that you have taught.
Sure. Every year I teach an introductory psychology course, so this is just a general survey course at the 100 level. At Michigan State, it's quite large, so I'm teaching that right now to 500 students. And then I always teach a smaller writing intensive course. This, in the past, has been the neuroscience of learning and memory, on alternate years with a course on sleep and circadian rhythms. In addition, I have taught a course on cognitive psychology, and I've taught my introductory level course as an honors section, so a much smaller, more intensive course.
Now, you're hired to do research, but what, I guess, restrictions or what types of barriers do you have for what direction you go?
We don't really have many barriers, honestly. So we are hired based on our research, and when we're hired, we let the school know what our research trajectory is likely to be. However, there's no one that I have to ask permission to pursue a new line of research. All of our research is approved by the Institutional Review Board, importantly, so it's ethically viable. But I don't have I don't have to get approval for anything that I do, other than that.
So I would assume, similar to if I started practicing law and I became more interested in criminal law versus business law, I could go the direction of representing more criminal clients. You're following me?
Yes, absolutely.
So with you, if your research interests kind of evolve as you become more, I guess, knowledgeable, you can kind of go the direction that you choose to go. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So when I was originally hired at Michigan State, most of my research focused on sleep and cognition, or how a period of sleep affected cognition and memory. Since I arrived there, however, I started to get more interested in sleep deprivation. So my research was originally focused really exclusively on sleep and cognition, and it went off into a couple different branches, but I think the one relevant today is looking at how sleep deprivation affects cognitive processing.
All right. What sort of research or what sort of publications do you review on a regular basis so that you're up to date on these things?
Several fields. Again, most of my research focuses on sleep and sleep deprivation. So most of the research I read focuses on how a period of sleep affects a memory representation, or how a period of sleep deprivation affects either cognitive function or physiological function. I also have a line of work looking at things like hand gesture and mathematical learning. So I also stay up to date on research looking at gesture and cognition as well.
Another thing that you're in charge of is sort of a sleep institute, is that right?
It's a laboratory. So because Michigan State is a research-intensive university, all faculty who pursue empirical research typically set up their own research laboratory, which is not true in all fields, but in psychology it is. So when I came to Michigan State in 2008, I set up this laboratory. So we have 2 separate rooms where we can run participants through behavioral tasks. And in one of these rooms, we actually have 2 bedrooms where we can have people sleep through the night, where we can monitor them with various physiological measures so that we can look at their sleep across the night. So we can look at their sleep stages and various attributes of sleep. In that room as well, we have sort of like a living room type area with several couches, a large TV, lots of snacks, so that we can keep people awake all night as well to look at sleep deprivation.
How do you find people that are willing to be involved in these studies?
College students. So we have, in most psychology programs, particularly in larger institutions, have what's called a study pool. So students who are taking psychology courses are either required to participate in studies, or they can participate in studies for extra credit. And so at MSU, every semester we have roughly 2,000 students who are enrolled in this pool. And they get to choose whatever they want to do. So they can do, online studies looking at personality, or they can come into my laboratory and stay awake all night or sleep all night. And of course, they get a lot more credit for doing those studies. So to get people to volunteer to be awake all night, for me, you would think that people would not want to do that. I would never want to do that. But these are, 18 to 22-year-old individuals, and they readily agree to do this.
Now, I know that there's some different, I guess, sleep deprivation is kind of a concentrated area. It's in psychology and then sleep and then the deprivation part. Are there other experts or people that you've worked with around the country in these different types of studies?
I have several collaborators across the country. Would you like me to name them?
Yes.
Okay. I've worked with Stephen Frenda, who is at California State University, Los Angeles, and Sherry Berkowitz, who's at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and Elizabeth Loftus, who is at University of California, Irvine. While I was a graduate student, I also volunteered in Ed Von Kauder's lab. So she is actually an endocrine doctor, so a medical doctor, who has a sleep lab in the medical school at University of Chicago.
Now, with Stephen Frenda and Elizabeth Loftus, I know that you collaborated very recently on a study that involved sleep deprivation and false confessions. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
When was it that you collaborated with those people?
The research was published in 2016, but the research process obviously takes a lot of time. So the data was probably collected, I would have to go back and actually check, but the end of 2014, maybe the beginning of 2015.
Right, and when you say the data was collected, what does that mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. That means that's when the participants came into the laboratory, stayed awake all night, or slept all night in the laboratory, and we ran them through all of our behavioral tasks.
Where did this take place?
This all took place in the Sleep and Learning Lab, so my laboratory at Michigan State University.
All right, and describe for the court the study.
Yeah. So the study was set up as a two-part study. So on day one, participants simply came into the laboratory and ran through several behavioral tasks. Importantly, on this day, we gave them a strict warning. We told them that throughout the day's procedures, they were allowed to do whatever they had to do, but they were not permitted to press the escape key on the keyboard. Importantly, these are basically Windows keyboards, so the escape key is kind of far up into the left. So all of our students are touch typists, so in order to press the key, you'd have to actually lift your hand up and hit the key. This is a procedure that we did not develop. It was developed by other researchers in the field. So we gave them this warning. We said, you cannot hit this key. If you hit this key, you'll lose a lot of our valuable data. They returned between 7 and 9 days later for their overnight session. On that night, they did not know if they were going to stay awake all night or if they were going to sleep in the laboratory. The research assistants did know at that point, simply because when people stay awake, we can run up to 6 people at one time, but if they're sleeping, we only have 2 beds. So they came in, they did some more computer tasks, and then they either stayed awake throughout the night, or they slept for 8 hours, or were given 8 hours to sleep. The sleep participants were woken up at 8 a.m. The deprivation participants, of course, stayed awake all night, and throughout the night we gave them snacks and water ad libitum and that sort of thing. And then at 9 a.m., we ran them through the rest of the study. And at that point, the very end, we had them read what they believed to be a personalized description of what they had done 7 to 9 days prior. And it was personalized for them. But importantly, what we told them is that when they were in the lab, 7 to 9 days prior, when everyone was fully rested, that they had pressed that critical key. They'd pressed the escape key. And we asked them to confirm whether or not this statement was true. If they said, yes, it's true, they completed the study and left the laboratory. If they said, no, it was not true, we asked them again. We said, well, this is what our research assistants told us. Can you just verify, is this true? And what we found is that when we looked at that, particularly that first question, that first query, participants who were sleep deprived, a full 50% of them said that they had pressed this critical key that they had not pressed. So this, for us, was evidence of essentially a false confession. If we looked at the rest of the participants, however, only 18% did so. And statistically, what that works out is an odds ratio of 4.5, meaning that people were 4.5 times more likely to falsely confess if they were sleep deprived than if they had slept the night before.
All right, you've done a number of different studies. Go ahead.
An interpreter would like to ask the witness to slow down.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
You've done a number of different studies on sleep deprivation and sleep studies, is that right?
That's correct.
Approximately how many do you do a year?
At any given point in time, we probably have between 3 and 5 studies going. And the way it works is, of course, you have to collect all your data and then analyze all your data and then write the paper and then have it published. So at any given point in time, we have, again, between probably 3 and 5 studies being conducted, as well as an additional 2 to 5 that are in various other stages.
how long does it take, and yeah, I'm sure this is a range, but how long does it take to complete a study?
There is a big range. So for studies where we have people overnight in the laboratory, it can take quite a long time, particularly if we have them sleep in the lab. So if they're sleeping in the lab, then we can only run 2 people per night. And of course, we have to monitor them all night, so we have to have personnel there all night. To have just 2 conditions, we'll say 40 people per group, whatever that group is, it can take typically a year. In our sleep deprivation studies, we've gotten a lot more efficient at running these. So we run 6 people per night, and in one school year, so 2 semesters, we can complete a sleep deprivation study with 100 people per group. So we keep 100 people awake all night, and the other 100 we send home to sleep, and we monitor their sleep just with wrist actigraphy and not with a full sleep setup.
I would assume that you're not able to do this all by yourself.
Absolutely not.
How is it that you run these operations, if I call them that?
Yes. Currently, I have 3 graduate students in the laboratory. One is actually defending her dissertation next week, so after that, there'll only be 2. And approximately, I think, 22 undergraduate students who work in the lab. That ranges from 22 to 25. It's actually probably closer to 25 right now. And those students all volunteer in the laboratory, and when we have studies that are grant funded, then we can pay them for their time. But currently, that's probably only about half the studies that we're running. So for both undergraduate and graduate students, this is, a really great opportunity for them to get hands-on research experience, which for the undergrads is critical for getting admitted to graduate school. And for graduate students, that is their education. So in graduate school, classes are not nearly as important as their research experience.
Now, I'm not going to bore us to tears and have you explain every single one of these studies, but I want to talk about a couple of different other studies that you've done that have dealt specifically with these fields of sleep deprivation. In 2014, you did a study that dealt with the effect of sleep deprivation on working memory. Is that right?
That was actually a review paper. So in that paper, we reviewed the literature in working memory and sleep deprivation, and essentially surveyed the field and came to our own conclusions about what the general findings were about sleep deprivation and working memory.
And you worked with this, with who on this research?
With Stephen Frenda.
So that's the same person in California that you worked with on this sleep study that you explained. Is that right?
That's correct.
You also did a research article, on sleep and eyewitness memory that dealt with false identifications. Is that right?
That's correct.
Just very general layman's terms, what did that deal with?
Yeah, so we were interested in whether a period of sleep would improve the ability for an eyewitness to identify the perpetrator of a mock crime. So participants were shown a mock crime video and tested either after a period of sleep or after a period of waking. What we found was that if the actual perpetrator was in the lineup, and this is a simultaneous lineup where they saw 6 images of potential perpetrators, there was no effective sleep. So sleep did not help individuals to correctly identify the person who committed the mock crime. However, if the perpetrator was left out of the lineup, so there were 6 people who did not commit the crime, after a period of sleep, participants were less likely to falsely recognize an innocent individual than if they were tested after a period of wake.
You also did a report, I believe this was more recent, on the effects of sleep deprivation and procedural errors. Is that right?
That's correct.
And just very briefly, what did that deal with?
What we found is that after a period of sleep deprivation, while participants were performing a procedural task where you have to do a task in a series of steps where you don't want to omit or repeat a step. So you can imagine a situation where you're either following a recipe or you're following protocols for even like a surgery, right? If you omit or repeat a step, it could be disastrous. And what we found is that after a period of sleep deprivation, participants showed a much higher likelihood of these errors, particularly after they had been interrupted. So again, when you're performing a procedure, if your cell phone goes off and you check it and you go back to your procedure, again, we showed that after sleep deprivation, there were more errors with the procedure and that the number of errors increased linearly with the time on task.
Now, there's a couple of terms that I guess you use as kind of baselines for different experiments. Is that right?
A couple of terms.
And I'll ask you specifically. There's a term called total sleep deprivation. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that something that you use kind of regularly as a kind of a standpoint or a point of time, ma'am?
A period of total sleep deprivation is when an individual has gone 24 hours or more with no sleep at all. And this is contrasted with sleep restriction, where an individual is given an opportunity to sleep for some amount of time during that night. So in sleep restriction studies, participants will often be given between 4 and 6 hours of sleep. So the question there is, what is the effect of reduced sleep on performance? In the total sleep deprivation experiments, we're looking at what is the effect of absolutely no sleep on performance.
And have you found that they both kind of produce the same symptoms or the same concerns?
Yes, I will say that I have not, I've helped with studies on sleep restriction. I've not done any in my own lab, but the results are very consistent. So essentially 3 to 5 nights of sleep restriction show essentially the same negative consequences as 1 night of total sleep deprivation.
Now, this would be a good time to talk about, what you've done in this case. Your review of the case file has been pretty limited, is that right?
Very limited, yes.
What have you reviewed in preparation for today's testimony?
I've reviewed a PowerPoint slideshow that showed images of the defendant throughout his interrogation, and I've reviewed some of the transcript of the interrogation.
Now, I also have given you kind of some basic facts that I expected would be introduced at the suppression hearing about Mr. Bahena Rivera and, what had led up to him being interviewed. Is that right?
You've told me about what happened that day, yes.
Okay. Specifically, I told you that it was expected that Mr. Bahena Rivera woke up between 4:30 and 5 in the morning. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that he was working the entire day at a farm doing kind of manual labor. Is that right?
Cleaning pens, I believe, is what.
And then he was taken to the law enforcement center here in Montezuma and interrogated consistently throughout the night. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, assuming that Mr. Bahena, let's just assume that he is wakes up at 5 a.m. to be conservative, it would be 5 a.m. the next morning then that he would be sleep deprived. Is that right?
That would be the time frame that we use to study sleep deprivation. But really, any time past his habitual sleep time would be considered sleep deprivation. So, for example, given that he wakes up so early, I would imagine that he probably goes to sleep around 10 or 11 p.m. If that's the case, then even by midnight, he's already suffering from lack of sleep. Now, when we run these studies, we usually wait 24 hours just so that we can counteract any effects of circadian rhythms, because testing people in the middle of the night is a very bad time for humans. So to get sort of over that hump, we wait 24 hours, so we're in a sort of a better circadian time, because the circadian effect will compound our sleep deprivation effect. And I can explain that if that's not clear.
Yes, I'm going to go into that. So you're saying that any time after someone normally goes to sleep, they're going to be tired and going to be suffering different effects from not being asleep. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
describe what circadian rhythms are.
Yeah, so our circadian rhythm is an endogenous, meaning produced inside of our body, 24-hour rhythm, or a rhythm that fluctuates on a roughly 24-hour cycle. It's essentially like a sinusoid, right? And the important thing there is you have a peak, but then you have this valley or low point, which we call the circadian nadir. So at the circadian nadir, essentially all of your physiological attributes are setting you up to sleep. So this is the time in the day when your body temperature is the lowest, your heart rate is lower, your respiration is slower, and all of your physiological functions are less good. And essentially all of your cognitive functions are also less good. Typically in humans, that circadian nadir, that bottom point, is between around 4 to 6 a.m. Mr. Rivera, given that he wakes up around 5-ish, his is probably shifted a little earlier than that. But we can't know without, essentially monitoring the temperature rhythm.
So everybody kind of fluctuates as to when that is that right?
The precise timing fluctuates, yes. But everyone will, based on your habitual bedtime. But given that we are, a diurnal species, and we typically sleep in roughly the same hours, we can estimate that, a person who goes to bed at 11 p.m. and wakes up at 7 a.m., that nadir will be around 4 to 6 a.m. But yeah, the precise timing we don't know.
And so the reason that you don't do testing before the 24 hours is so that you don't, I guess, get a false positive or from this circadian rhythm that happens overnight. Is that right?
That's correct. So any task that you give people, regardless of how much they've slept prior, if you hit that circadian nadir, they will just be worse at it. One way that you can think of it, or that you can sort of conceptualize it, is there's a second dip in the mid-afternoon occurring somewhere between 2 and 4 p.m. And we've all experienced that. You probably can feel it, right? So roughly around that time, you feel a little sleepier, and people usually attribute this to lunch, right? They, had a turkey sandwich and they think it's the tryptophan, but really it's your own body's clock, kind of slowing down essentially. So your body temperature shows a little dip, and your underlying physiology is sort of setting you up for sleep. But yeah, so regardless of how much people have slept, if you test them in their circadian nadir, they will be worse at just about everything that has been tested thus far.
Now, one thing that you've pointed out to me before is that you noticed kind of a correlation with what you would suspect would be Mr. Rivera's circadian rhythm and when he started making some admissions in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
Approximately what time was that?
I believe it was around 4 o'clock, 4:30 maybe.
Okay.
That's just based on the transcript, though. I didn't have exact timing.
Right, and you're looking at the transcript, which is, I guess, military time on the heading. Is that right?
Yes.
Ma'am, with sleep deprivation, through your studies, and through your work, have you also found out kind of a different susceptibility to different things, rewards or consequences?
Yeah, so in my own work, I have not, but there is a large literature looking at both of those things. So what we know is that response to sleep deprivation shows strong individual differences, so much that we think it's essentially a trait, meaning that some people are more or less prone to deficits due to sleep deprivation. So you may know someone in your life who pulls all-nighters all the time and doesn't seem to be affected by it, whereas I know if I can't imagine a night without sleep. And what other studies have shown is that using functional magnetic resonance imaging, that the brain responds differently to rewards and losses in a state of sleep deprivation. So what they find is that when the brain is anticipating a reward, it shows a stronger response under conditions of sleep deprivation than if people have slept, and it shows a reduced response to negative consequences compared to people who have slept.
Personas de canto.
Kimberly just wants to remind the witness to speak at a little slower pace, please.
I apologize.
It's okay.
I'm from Connecticut. We speak very fast there.
So what you mean is that somebody, if they are sleep deprived, if they see some possible positive outcome, that they're more likely to take that than consider a consequence. Is that right?
Yes. So the work that has investigated this has used primarily, there's been a number of tasks, but they've, do you mind if I just explain the task?
Yes.
They've actually, there have been several studies that have used a task actually developed here in Iowa called the Iowa Gambling Task. And in this task, it's supposed to be a model of risky decision making. So participants are given 4 decks of cards, and they're told that 2 of the decks are good decks and 2 of the decks are bad decks, but they don't know which is which. And they start uncovering cards, and with each card, they either get a reward, so essentially a monetary reward, or a loss, a monetary loss. And they're told that they will get an actual reward based on how much money they accumulate. 2 of the decks, however, the good decks, have lower monetary rewards, but in the long run, they have fewer losses, so it ends up a net gain. The other 2 decks, which are considered the bad decks, show higher monetary reward, but also higher losses. And in the long run, if you keep flipping cards from those decks, you end up losing money. What we find, and there's 2 main findings, or what other individuals have found, I should say. 2 main findings. First, regular individuals, before they're sleep deprived, stick with the good decks. So before they even know what's happening, they just keep going back to the good decks. After a period of sleep deprivation, however, they shift their responding and keep going for the bad decks. And this is a pattern we don't see typically, with the exception of patients with frontal lobe damage, although the effect is exacerbated even more in them. And then what we find is that if you look at the neural processing of this, during this task or during similar tasks, when they think they're going to get that reward, the area of the brain that processes reward behavior is heightened, so it shows a greater response to reward, again, compared to people who are fully rested. And then when they get a loss, what they show is that the area of the brain that processes that loss shows less of a response, again, compared to participants who are rested.
Now, your foundation or your sleep institute does not have access to equipment that studies the brain. Is that right?
We actually do. So we have a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner on MSU's campus. I do not currently do work using that technology, though.
But you have done research and you keep up to date on that technology that is used often with sleep deprivation. Is that right?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And describe what this machine does.
Yeah, I can't describe the physics to you because that's way beyond my knowledge. But essentially what it does is it measures blood flow in the brain. So like a muscle, the more you use specific areas of the brain, the more blood that needs to go to essentially to support that area of the brain. So we can actually look at your brain while you're performing a task. So just as an example, if we put you in the scanner and showed you a bunch of pictures, we could look at your visual cortex being active. And so here we're looking at subcortical structures that are important for processing reward-based behavior. So
What does this show when this machine is used with sleep deprivation studies?
Yeah, so there are a number of consistent findings. What we know, sort of baseline, is that the brain is in a very different state during sleep deprivation than it is when it's rested. The strongest or the most consistent change is in the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex. So this is an area of the brain that's important for executive function, planning, any kind of like strategic thought is all essentially mediated by the frontal lobe. And typically what people find is that when participants are performing tasks that require the frontal lobe, they show reduction of activation of this area. So meaning the brain is just not working as hard as it needs to. And that's accompanied with reduced performance on these tasks. There are some cases, however, where people can perform regularly and so at the same level as a rested individual, and what those studies typically show is extra activation in this area, suggesting a compensatory response. So in order for the brain to behave on a regular, normal level, it has to work extra hard. There are also studies that show that areas of the brain that essentially talk to each other, so we call this functional connectivity, so different areas of the brain are essentially communicate regularly with each other. This connectivity is reduced in individuals who are sleep deprived.
Are people able to just bounce back between sleep, awake, sleep, awake, sleep, awake?
No. For a couple of reasons. The first one is that after a period of sleep, you typically go through a period of what's called sleep inertia. So we've all experienced this. You can sort of think of your own experience waking up. It is not the case that, as soon as you're awake, you are at optimal functioning, right? It can take anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 hours to get to your normal level of functioning. And of course, that the amount of sleep inertia a person goes through varies depending on a number of factors. One, of course, being the stage of sleep they wake up from. Two, the time, the circadian time can affect sleep inertia. And of course, the situations in which you wake up. So normally, if you're a person who has a 30-minute period of sleep inertia, but your fire alarm goes off, you can kind of bypass it.
All right. Now, I'm going to show you some portions of Mr. Rivera's interview, which is in a slideshow presentation. I believe you've reviewed that. Is that right?
Yes.
To be clear, you don't claim to have any expertise in law enforcement techniques or interview techniques or that sort of thing. Is that right?
Zero.
You're purely sleep. May I approach that?
Go ahead.
TV's off, Jim. Bottom right corner.
Now, this shows the interview throughout with Mr. Bahena Rivera. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I am just going to refer to slides generally, but throughout the interview, did you notice several points where Mr. Rivera was showing signs that he was tired or sleepy?
Yes, and I think in some of them, he actually had fallen asleep.
Well, let's talk first about what signs that you saw that he was sleepy or that he was exhausted.
I think there were several situations in which, particularly when there was no one in the room, he either put his head down on the table or he would lean back in his chair and put his hat over his head. And, typically that's not something that people who are not sleepy would do. particularly in this sort of situation. So another thing to remember is that this is a very stressful situation, and when we undergo stress, we have activation of the autonomic nervous system and a stress response. And I won't go into details, I will if you want, but essentially what that means is that we're producing a lot of cortisol. And cortisol is the hormone that, one, helps you wake up. So every morning, right at that circadian idea, we all have this big increase in cortisol in our system, and that helps us to wake up. So he's getting all these signals to wake up, and he's still falling asleep.
If you're being accused of murdering another human being, then you would expect a huge cortisol reaction in regards to that. Is that right?
Yes.
But throughout the interview, and again, I'm referring to, it looks like it's page 20 from Brian Leslie's report. This is a portion of the interview where you see Mr. Rivera is slumped back. He's got his head down. He's not staring at his phone or anything like that. Is that right?
That's correct.
And throughout the interview, there were multiple different times where it was seen that Mr. Rivera was either slumped back, like that's shown again on page 27 of Brian Leslie's report, that it appears that he is sleeping. Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, we're looking at more pictures from Brian Leslie's report, but your testimony is that we're looking at all the sleeping, but in the meantime, he's being woken up and put back to sleep and woken up. Your opinion as to whether or not he can effectively just wake back up and start answering questions is what?
I'm going to object to that question. I don't think she's in a position to provide that type of information.
Sustained.
Ma'am, in studies and with your research, if someone is someone able to fall asleep and wake up multiple different times and just wake up and respond?
That typically does not happen. I think when I was looking at these, one thing that struck me is that I think what we're seeing here is something called wake state instability. So the areas of the brain that control sleep and waking are actually distinct. It's not one area of the brain, but it's a bistable circuit, meaning that they mutually inhibit each other. So what this means is that the two states are either on or off, much like a light switch, right? So, and again, you know this intuitively if you think back to last night. You didn't go from being awake and then 20% asleep and 30% asleep and 40% asleep. You were awake and then you were asleep, right? So it's a very stable system, and this is important because it helps individuals or prevents individuals from swapping states, right? So right now in this courtroom, none of us are just going to fall asleep. Right? We could all put our heads down and no one's going to fall asleep unless someone here is diagnosed with narcolepsy. We know that during sleep deprivation, however, there's a reduction in the stability of this system. So people are more likely to shift states and to do so more rapidly. So in addition to falling asleep and waking up, people also have things called microsleep. So a microsleep is a very short period of sleep that just intrudes into waking. So this can be a half a second up to 30 seconds. Right? So this is one of the dominant reasons why driving while you're really tired is so dangerous, because it happens for such a short amount of time, and people are often not even aware that they've fallen asleep.
So even though Mr. Rivera, let's take away the times that he actually is sleeping, even when he's awake and he's conversing with law enforcement, the effects of sleep are still problematic. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So there's two factors working against him in some ways. The first is that, of course, he's gone this long period without sleep. And the other thing is he's in that going at least down into that circadian nadir. So his eyes may be open, but that doesn't tell us anything about the underlying physiology behind it.
I have no further questions.
Cross-examination.
Hang on just a second. Dr. Fenn, good morning.
Good morning.
How long have you been engaged in this line of study that you just described with Ms. Freeze?
Oh my goodness, that is a good question. I think she first contacted me a month or two ago.
I'm not talking about the involvement particular with this case. I'm talking about sleep deprivation.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I think our first study was published in 2014, but we began data collection around 2012.
Okay, so for about the last 7 or so years, you've had this interest, is that right?
Yes, and while I was a graduate student, I volunteered in Ed Von Kauder's lab, and so she was looking at sleep restriction, which is slightly different, but as I explained before, she was interested in multiple nights of reduced sleep.
Have you ever testified in a criminal case concerning the same subject matter?
I have not.
This is the first time you've ever testified?
That's correct.
The other, your other research collaborators that you listed?
Yes.
Do you know if they have ever testified in a criminal court?
Yes.
Who is that?
Elizabeth Loftus has, Sherry Berkowitz has, and Stephen Frenda has.
And it, plus you, that's the group that did the study in 2014, is that correct?
That's correct. Oh, 2016, our 2014 paper did not include Sherry Berkowitz.
I meant 2016. If I said 2014, I apologize. So the study that you used to author your article, you described it where you would use subjects that are students, correct?
Correct.
And you would put them in a laboratory setting, in effect, is that correct?
Correct.
And they knew that that's what they were there for, is that right?
That's correct.
And then you set up an exercise for them where they would be up basically all night, is that right?
That's correct.
All right, and then you would tell them the next morning that you would warn them by pressing an escape key on a keyboard would cause loss of study data, is that right?
Yes.
What is study data?
We left that intentionally ambiguous. So we just said you would cause us to lose valuable data. So right. Maybe
So
said it wrong.
the subjects of your study knew that if they pressed the escape key, something bad would happen.
Yes.
And that study data would relate to their classwork?
So they participate in studies for their classes. Again, we left it ambiguous, so we didn't tell them that they would lose credit in their class or that it would affect their grade in any way.
Then after they were kept up all night, they were asked to sign a statement, correct?
Correct.
Which summarized their activities in the laboratory of the previous, 24 hours?
No, it was actually summarizing their activities in the laboratory when they came in about 7 to 9 days prior.
Okay. And then you created a false allegation to them where you told them or accused them of pressing the escape key.
That's correct.
All right. And after a single request, the odds of signing the statement were 4.5 times higher, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, I would assume that you would have some way to independently corroborate whether or not the student pressed the escape key. Is that true?
We did not, no.
You just took them at their word?
We did. As I said before, our students are all touch typists, so unless they had some nefarious goal that day and intentionally pressed the button, we had no reason to believe that they would. But you're right, we don't have that information.
But if they pressed the escape key in your study, you would know that, correct?
No, we would not.
You would have you have no way to independently know that?
No, we do not.
Okay. Independent evidence of what actually occurred is important, correct?
Yes.
I assume that would be true for your studies,
Yes.
as well as what happens in, I don't mean to demean what you do, it's not real life, but in real life, like in an actual situation, correct?
Correct.
All right.
I will say, however, that when they came in for that first session, they were not. We had not decided their condition yet, so there's no reason to believe that the people who intentionally hit a key would necessarily end up in one group over the other.
Okay. And despite, if a person is sleep deprived, they're still able to carry on conversations, correct?
Correct.
They're still able to accurately perform tasks, correct?
It depends on the task, and it depends on your definition of accurate.
Well, I understand that, but in your studies, not everybody signed a false confession, correct?
Correct.
All right, so there were people who were able to carry on and essentially testify or provide accurate information,
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
Now, the photos that we looked at, did you actually look at the interview, the video itself?
I did not.
All right, so you're basing whatever you're testifying to off still photos that were taken from a video, is that
That's
right?
correct, yes.
Did you take into account in making any observations concerning Cristhian Rivera what officers said concerning how he behaved and how he acted?
I did not know.
All right. Are you aware that he led officers to the body of Mollie Tibbetts after?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. I mean, if that's what he did, he would certainly be capable of doing it, correct?
Be capable of doing what, sir?
Well, the evidence in this case is that Cristhian Rivera took the officers to Mollie Tibbetts' body. You're not aware of that, right?
That is, I don't have any expertise in that, no.
If he is able to do that in a sleep-deprived state, we have independent evidence of that, correct?
We have independent evidence of what?
What I'm asking you is, the evidence in this case, I know you don't know it, but I'm telling you now.
Okay.
Okay? Is that after this interview, he took officers from Yerriby Farms to Mollie Tibbetts' body.
Okay.
All right? So the question is, if he is able to do that, he would have done it in a sleep-deprived state, correct?
Correct.
Did you ever talk to Cristhian Rivera?
I have not, no.
You've not met with him?
I have not.
You've not had a chance to talk to him or anyone else about what his actual mindset was, correct?
I don't speak Spanish.
Okay, but you've not been able to converse with him at all, is that
No,
right?
not at all.
Or you've chosen maybe not to do that, or not been asked to, correct?
Correct.
Have you ever done any studies or worked with law enforcement in these situations?
I have not.
Have you ever studied interviews of suspects who have been in an alleged sleep-deprived state?
I have not.
Have you ever interviewed persons who have been convicted of crimes where they claim to have falsely confessed?
I have not.
Have you been provided other examples other than the photos of where Cristhian Rivera is alert during questioning?
The only photos I've seen were the ones in the slideshow. Well, there are several others than the ones that were shown here.
And you're certainly in no position to actually testify as to what the actual effect was on him concerning what occurred on August 20th and 21st, correct?
I cannot specify what actually happened to him, no. All I can tell you is what happens generally under conditions of sleep
Which is,
deprivation.
I understand that you're an academic, correct?
Correct.
You do studies, is that right?
Correct, that's correct.
All right, and then you provide us information, is that right?
That's correct.
The articles that you've authored been peer reviewed,
Correct.
right? And they're published in that way, is that correct?
That's correct.
But they are academic studies that involve college students in the manner that you've described, right?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Fenn. I don't have further questions.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Ms. Fenn, thank you for being here. You're excused.
Okay, thank you.
Defense may call their next witness.
Your Honor, we call Brian Leslie.
Good morning. Why don't you go ahead and set that in front of you so I can swear you in?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm the testimony about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay. Go ahead and be seated now.
Jeff.
Go ahead, Mr. Priest.
Thank you. If you would please, sir, state your name for the record.
Brian Anthony Leslie,
Would you please state your name, or spell your name?
B-R-I-A-N, Anthony, A-N-T-H-O-N-Y, Leslie, L-E-S-L-I-E.
Sir, how are you employed?
I have my own firm called Criminal Case Consultants.
And that firm, Criminal Case Consultants, just generally tell us what you do.
I'm a coercive interrogation expert. I deal in interrogations, witness statements, victim statements, also investigative analysis as well on how investigations are conducted.
And how long have you been with Criminal Case Consultants?
Just over 6 years on a regular basis.
Can you tell us what you did before forming your own firm, Criminal Case Consultants?
Well, my background is basically police work. I've been in policing for just over 14 and a half years, chief of police for almost 2 years.
Where were you an officer at?
I was in Canada, in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario.
And where is Criminal Case Consultants located?
I have an office in Buffalo, New York, as well as one in Toronto, as well as I hold 2 residences as well.
So you're a dual resident of Canada and America?
And America, yeah.
What education or training do you have in the area? Let's start with policing.
In policing, generally, I have basic investigative training, which everybody goes through. I've taken specialized courses in analytical investigative methods as well. I have some university, some college.
Okay. Let's talk about the transition from the public sector to the private sector. What led to that?
I took some time off from my policing career afterwards, and then I decided to, because I had done a lot of research when I was policing, especially when I was in chief of police, that I had done some research a lot into witnesses and victims and deception of witnesses and looking at statements and how they're conducted and interviews and interrogations.
What caused you to be interested in that particular area?
Just because I was dealing with it on a regular basis, and I was always concerned about how to vet a witness properly to ensure that witnesses were telling primarily the truth most of the time.
Now, in your training and in your experience, just kind of generally tell us the methodology or the tactics used by law enforcement to interview or interrogate witnesses.
Now, generally, in the interview process, there's a technique called the READ technique, which is implemented and standardized throughout U.S., Canada, which is basically for interviews as well as interrogation methods. I, at the time, had taken several in-service training at that particular time on interview techniques. I've also conducted over 2,000 in my whole career. of interviews as well as interrogations. And as a result of it, after I finished policing, I had written 2 books on the subject of patterning body language.
So you've participated yourself in over 2,000 interviews and interrogations?
Absolutely, yeah.
And you've also authored 2 books?
2 books.
And what are those books, what's their area of subjects?
Well, specifically, I had created a methodology called reaction analysis profiling, which basically patterned body language so that during the time I was interviewing witnesses, that I could have some sort of a baseline to determine and vet them. And so the 2 books, Visual Liar and Deception of a Witness, I had written those 2 books.
Are you published anywhere else?
Well, I write articles, contribute to legal magazines, Legal 360 as well.
Have you been published in the last 12 months?
Yes.
In what magazines or treatises?
I believe Legal 360 and also there's a few others. Can I refer to my CV? Yeah.
Well, you're referring to your CV, which is Exhibit Z. I put it there in front of you. Exhibit Z, as you refer to it, is that the most recent and updated copy of your curriculum vitae?
No, I have one that's a little bit more updated.
Okay. Well, looking at Exhibit Z, as far as what needs to be updated, tell us what needs to be added to Exhibit
I
Z.
just add more cases to it primarily. There may be some more media that's added to it, but primarily this, when this was received, I don't know, when was this received?
I can't tell you.
Okay.
It would have been in conjunction with your report, when was your report written, Mr. Leslie?
Oh. That was on the 19th of July, 2019.
There's been updates to that since then?
Very few, very minimal.
So it fairly and accurately represents your training, your education, your experience as it pertains to your discipline, which is coercive interrogation techniques, right?
That's correct.
Now let's also just kind of clear something up. When you say coercive interrogation techniques, that term does not necessarily equate with misconduct, right?
No, that's correct, and there's a misconception about that. Coercive questioning doesn't necessarily mean misconduct, and on its own doesn't even mean that it affects an interview. In the totality of it, based on whatever the vulnerability of the individual potentially could have been, that's where it becomes an issue.
So you can look at an interview or an interrogation, and you could say that coercive techniques were used, and still say that an officer acted professionally and or did not act with misconduct, right?
Absolutely.
Now, you've testified in many cases?
Yeah, I've testified, most of the time I usually submit reports. I've testified in probably over 15 cases that I've actually gone to court for.
In both the United States and Canada?
Just in the United States. Canada, I was more of a consultant on cases.
Do you also testify in both civilian courts and military courts?
That's correct.
Have you been certified in any court as an expert witness?
Yes, military courts as well as the state of Minnesota.
The courts in which you testified, you were certified as a forensic expert in this discipline?
That's correct.
And the testimony you're here to give today is limited to your expertise in the area of coercive interrogation and interview techniques, specifically as it pertains to the interview of Cristhian Bahena.
That's correct.
How did you come to be involved in the Cristhian Bahena case?
I was contacted by your office originally, and we had communications, and as a result of that, you uploaded video interviews or interrogation interviews that conducted with Rivera, and as a result of it, there were 7 parts. I looked at, and plus there was an audio version of one that was at a farm. I looked at those and examined them. I also asked for transcripts. Originally, I was given transcripts, and then a second set of transcripts were then provided to me that were provided by your office that had been changed somewhat because there was some, they weren't exactly the same. So I got the most updated transcripts when I did the examination. I based everything on the transcripts for the purposes of the language, because I do not speak Spanish. Also, a notice on this was that the videos that I did receive were out of sync in a lot of cases. So there wasn't, but I didn't understand Spanish anyway. So the time codes that I was referring to were not potentially accurate. So I used the transcripts as a reference point when I was doing the examination, except for the areas that I point out into the report when I'm using stills from the video.
Explain that a little more clearly for us, if you would. The time codes didn't match up with what you just said, or what I heard.
Well, so basically in any interrogation, the perfect world is to have time code burns on the screens of a video. Now in this case, they didn't have time code burns. I had to refer to the running time codes that were on the video itself, which is basically, it's on the bottom of it's not on the screen itself, it's just basically a running time code of what the video as it's going through. And I think every one of these was, if I may refer to my report, about an hour and 41 minutes on each one of the videos, and they're broken into 7 parts.
In your experience in reviewing videos, which I assume you do regularly, correct?
That's correct.
Videos of interviews, correct?
That's correct.
Is the technology today commonplace where law enforcement has the ability to burn time codes into video?
Well, that's correct. But in some cases, what happens if the interview is conducted in a place outside of a controlled environment, for example, there may not be that access. They may have video. They may be using a different camera. They may use a temporary camera just for an office that they set up temporarily to do an interview.
Can we approach this briefly?
Yeah. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch at this time. We'll be in recess for the next hour. We'll resume at 12:30. Thank you, everyone.